Good evening. Uh, Tonight, I want to do a bit of review and discuss a little bit about what was going on in Ernest Hemingway's 1925 written Soldier's Home. It's possible, likely, that Hemingway was writing from experience. This short story probably reveals some of the same struggles that he dealt with after he returned from war. Its setting is from around the area of about 1915 to 1917. Excuse me, I believe it's 1917 to 1919 when the main character returns home from war. The main character leaves uh, from his small, most likely small town in Oklahoma. So he's a Midwesterner. He leaves college, goes to war, enlists in the Marines, and his name is Harold. However, we find in the story Hemingway often calls him Curbs. As one other gentleman has noted, probably a last name from his military time. I would make a note that he left as Harold as a young man with a religious background, because we see in the story that he was attending a Methodist college in Kansas, and he returns a hardened, almost cold, withdrawn soldier, Curbs. And the story is set in his hometown. Most likely, it's summertime. His home is a large part of the setting. We find him spending time late in the morning and sleeping late, rising to read from his front porch, and so you can almost feel the warm air blowing through the windows of his second story bedroom, through across the front porch. His home probably, one could believe, was a colonial style two-story with a long front porch set on a quiet neighborhood street that is lined with trees. We know that because Hemingway makes notes that Curbs would often sit on his front porch and observe the local girls walking by, and they would come in and out of the shadows of the trees. He leaves a war-torn world of Germany and France, but it was very simplistic to him. He understood what was required. The young ladies that he met there were to his liking, possibly because he couldn't communicate with them. And he returns home to a much more complicated world than he had left. The young ladies' hair is much shorter, and they seem much more complicated than the ladies in Germany. And that causes him trouble. He leaves a young man. He comes home, what I would describe an unrecognized hero. He had witnessed some of the most gruesome battles of the war, and yet he found himself either unwilling to talk about the war, and then when he was willing, people were unwilling to listen, and they did not recognize the value of his stories. And so he becomes really withdrawn. He withdraws from his family, he sleeps late, he withdraws from society, and even when he is in public and out and about, he's withdrawn, and we find him almost stalking young ladies. And then when he is in a social gathering, it is what's described as a dark pool room. It appears that he is very withdrawn. His mother has a great burden for him. Clearly, they're very religious people, and it appears that he was a religious man going to a Methodist college, but he comes home not a religious young man, but a much more hardened individual. He struggles, unfortunately, I think, with what many of our soldiers throughout the world, throughout our time as a nation, have struggled with. They leave knowing life, and they come home, and life has moved on to some degree without them. Now, parts of his life remain the same. His dad was still the same. withdrawn man he was, drove the same car, worked in the same building. So some parts remained the same. However, many became radically different. Um, in his struggle, it we find that it becomes to a pretty climactic end with a early morning breakfast. His mom calls him and says, "Come have breakfast." He has breakfast, and then she applies the pressure and begins to call on him to move on with his life. And she begins to compare him to other young men who have moved on from the war. But he's unwilling, and through an argument, he says some very hurtful things to his mother. And the story ends with him reverting back to what he had done when he first came home. He was lying. He lied to his mother, and ultimately uh, he leaves. He packs up and leaves, and we find him still searching for that peace and contentment that he found in war here in America, in Oklahoma, but he wasn't able to find it. I think that's why we see Hemingway, because it said of him that he struggled with adjusting. And so we see this Curbs, our main character, struggling with adjusting. He sees the ladies he longed for, but he wasn't willing to commit to them. He wasn't willing to be involved in the relationship and the complication of relationships. He longed to be back in Germany where the life seemed simpler and easier. A great story. Highly recommend anyone reading it.